In the final years of the 42nd millennium, when the Great Rift had torn the galaxy in two, and the Emperor's light had become a guttering candle across half the heavens, a single rogue trader vessel slipped its moorings above Port Maw and vanished into the void that men had begun to call Imperium Nihilus. The ship was the Stellar Requiem, a grand cruiser of ancient and murderous lineage, its hull plated in black adamantium and gold filigree, its prow sculpted into the screaming visage of a long-dead saint. At its helm stood Captain Ilara Voss, last scion of the warrant-bearing line of House Voss, a woman whose beauty had been burned away by radiation and ambition until only sharp cheekbones and colder eyes remained her augmetic retina's twin rubies of Martian craft, flickered through 1,000 spectra as she regarded the forbidden star chart projected upon the bridge's hololith. A route into the ghoul stars, the graveyard of forgotten species, where even the Inquisition feared to tread the chart, had cost her 300,000 souls and the life of an Inquisitor Lord. It had been torn from the memory core of a Necron tomb ship that she herself had cracked open above the dead world of Vorgoth Secundus. The Xenos glyphs had translated with the help of a captured cryptek, still screaming in its own tongue to a single phrase repeated in 1,000 dialects. The pale cache sleeps beneath the silent stars. Touch not the 11th, lest death awaken undying. Ilara Voss had smiled at that warning the way a wolf smiles at a locked gate for 9 months. The Requiem prowled the ghoul stars, evading the gravitational ghosts of dead suns and the silent patrols of Necron sentry ships, its holds filled with blackstone shards, phase blades that screamed when unsheathed, and the frozen corpses of Xenos that had never been catalogued by the Ordo Xenos. Then, on the 317th day, the navigator screamed in her tank, and the ship lurched from the warp into a silent nebula of shattered hulls. They were Imperial Thunderhawks locked in rhyme strike cruisers drifting like gutted whales. Every transponder, every faded numeral, every half-erased legionary marking spoke the same impossible truth. Legion Yatinth, the Pale Sons, the 11th, the Legion that had been stricken from the rolls of history by the Emperor's own hand. Before Horus had ever drawn breath, Ilara Voss stood upon the command dais in her greatcoat of void whale leather and regarded the impossible fleet with the hunger of a starving woman before a banquet. Her bridge crew, Catachan veterans and void-born officers who had followed her through a dozen forbidden zones, shifted uneasily. Even the ship's machine spirit seemed to recoil, lumen globes dimming as though in mourning. "Boarding parties," Voss said, voice flat and cold, as the void outside, full hazard protocols. If a single one of them still breathes, I want it alive. 6 assault shuttles launched into the silent stormtroopers in matte black carapace Catachan devils in flak, greatcoats, and Voss herself, in her personal void armor of crimson and gold. They cut through the hull of the largest wreck, a battle barge that had once borne the name Pallid Oath, and stepped into corridors where time itself had frozen frost. Crystals glittered like diamonds on every surface. Emergency lumens still glowed with the faint red of standby power that had endured for 10,000 years. Cryopods lined the walls in perfect endless ranks, 20,000 of them each containing a transhuman giant in pristine white and silver Mark II power armor. The aquila upon their breastplates had been deliberately defaced, a single vertical scar carved through the eagle's heart, the mark of expurgation. Voss walked the aisle between the pods as though strolling through a cathedral of the dead. Her breath plumed in the sub-zero air, her Lespistol, an ancient archaeotech piece taken from the cold hand of an Eldar Corsair prince, never left her grip, one pod larger than the rest, and positioned at the very center of the vault, shuddered. Frost cracked like breaking glass. Cryogas vented in a hissing cloud, the color of spoiled milk. The pod's occupant awoke with the fluid, predatory grace of a creature that had never truly slept. He was taller than any space marine Voss had ever seen. Even among the Primarchs, his skin was the color of moonlight on bone. His eyes, when the helm lenses retracted, were the pale gray of a winter sky. Before snow, a bolter rose in one smooth motion, muzzle steady on Voss's forehead. "You are not wolves," the giant stated, voice a low avalanche across internal vox. "Nor are you of the sigillites, black-clad butchers. Speak your name and purpose, mortal, or I will paint these walls with what passes for your soul." Ilara Voss did not flinch. She had stared down demon princes and Necron overlords. A single Astartes, even one 10,000 years old, did not frighten her. Captain Ilara Voss, rogue, traitor, militant bearer of the warrant eternal, signed by the hand of Roboute Guilliman himself. These vessels fall under my salvage rights by ancient and unbreakable law. But I offer you more than salvage, son of the 11th. I offer resurrection. The giant's helm tilted a fraction behind the crimson lenses. Something ancient and terrible considered her words for 3 days. The pale suns awoke 5,000 at first, then 10, then 20,000. The cryo-vaults yielding their harvest, like a field of white wheat under a silent scythe. Their armor servos whined to life. After 10 millennia of sleep, their bolters accepted fresh magazines forged in the Requiem's manufactorum. With the reverence of priests receiving communion, they moved with the perfect synchronization of warriors who had fought together for centuries and had never truly died. Sergeant Cale Draven of the 17th Expeditionary Battalion, last surviving officer of the 11th Legion, stood before Ilara Voss in the Pallid Oath's grand strategium and listened as she laid out her vision, a new realm carved from the ghoul stars, free of Terra's dying light, free of Guilliman's taxes and the High Lord's decrees, free of the lies that had seen an entire legion murdered. Draven's answer was simple, delivered in a voice that had not been used in 10,000 years, and yet carried the weight of every one of them. "We were betrayed. Once we will not be betrayed again. Lead us, rogue traitor, and we shall follow. Betray us, and the galaxy will learn why the Emperor feared his pale sons." Thus was born the Pale Resurgent. The first war of the Pale Resurgent was fought not against the Imperium, but against the dead who refused to remain. So Vorgoth Prime Crownworld of the Nihilak dynasty had slumbered undisturbed since the war in heaven. Its tomb complexes delved 1,000 kilometers beneath a crust of black glass, guarded by phalanxes of immortal warriors whose very atoms obeyed the commands of their pharaon when the Pallid Oath and its attendant fleet translated above the dead world. The Necrons awoke as one emerald lightning split the void. Entire destroyer squadrons materialized inside the pale formation, gauss flux arcs carving through escorts as though they were paper. Ilara Voss watched the hololith with the calm of a woman who had wagered everything on a single throw of the dice and discovered the dice were loaded in her favor. The Pale Suns did not fight like any legion she had ever chronicled. They did not advance in disciplined firing lines, nor execute the sweeping charges of the Space Wolves. They simply walked forward through the fire gauss flares, stripped ceramite to atoms, flesh, vaporized bone flashed to ash. And still they walked where a warrior fell. The plague within his gene seed rewrote damaged tissue in heartbeats. Limbs regrew armor, reknitted itself from necrodermis fragments torn from fallen foes. Within minutes, the Pale Suns were no longer merely transhuman. They were something the Necrons had never encountered in 60 million years of war, an enemy that adapted faster than living metal could destroy. Kyle Draven led the first breach in person. His power scythe, forged from a Ceton shard, taken from the Requiem's vaults, sang a note of pure annihilation as it carved through a Necron overlord's phase-shimmering torso, where the blade past reality itself bled pale light. The overlord's component atoms did not rephase. They simply ceased, devoured by the weapon's starving edge. By the seventh day, the surface of Vorgoth Prime was littered with the twitching remains of Necron immortals, who had discovered to their eternal horror that some things could die twice deep beneath the crust in the dynasty's central tomb. Voss's tech priests uncovered the true prize, a stasis crypt, containing a complete Cetan shard of the Deceiver bound in blackstone chains. Draven ordered it brought aboard the Pallid Oath under heaviest guard, when Voss asked why the Pale Lord Reaper's answer was quiet. Because the Emperor once feared what we might become if we ever learn the truth? Let us see what we become when we wield the tools he denied us. Within a standard year, the Ghoul stars changed hands. 9 subsectors fell under the white banner of the pale resurgent rogue traders, bent the knee or died. Entire forge complexes were raised from the bones of Necron tomb worlds. Voss's dynasty swelled to rival the greatest navigator houses, and in the shadowed stratagems of the Pallid Oath, Kael Draven read the forbidden chronicles sealed by Malcador. The Sigillite himself, he learned the name of his Primarch, a name that had been burned from every record in the Imperium Valerian, the Ashen, the Pale King, the 11th Son, whose very existence had been deemed too dangerous to live. He learned why, during the Rangdan genocides, the 11th had been deployed against a biohorror that turned entire sectors into screaming flesh gardens. Valerian's gene seed, uniquely receptive to Xenos taint, adapted. His sons became perfect carriers of a plague that killed everything it touched. Human, Xenos, Daemon, even the Neverborn themselves withered. The Pale Sons won the war. Then the Emperor looked upon what he had wrought and saw not victory, but the end of all things. Russ was sent with the execution warrant. Valerian met his brother on the ash plains of Cerberus Prime, and knelt, offering his neck. Russ wept as he struck the blow. The Pale Sons were hunted. Across a dozen systems, 20,000 transhuman angels were slaughtered by their own kin. Only Draven's battalion, sealed in stasis by Malcador for study, had survived when Draven closed the final data slate. His hands did not shake, but something ancient and terrible settled behind his pale eyes across the galaxy. The ripples spread on Baellord. Dante dreamed of white-armored angels with wings of bone who wept blood that healed the black rage on Fenris. The rune priests howled of ghosts that walked the snows and left no footprints on Prospero's shattered ruins. Ahriman felt the warp itself recoil from a new anti-psyker field emanating from the Ghoul stars like a void in the Empyrean. Then came the emissary of Yniad, Yvraine, herald of the Whispering God, stepped from a webway portal directly onto the bridge of the Pallid Oath with an honor guard of harlequins, whose masks reflected futures that would never be. Not a single pale sun raised a weapon. The air itself grew cold with the presence of death. She walked to Draven and spoke in perfect low Gothic. The 11th were always Yniads. Your gene seed was touched by the Aeldari death god before your emperor ever scattered you among the stars. Every pale sun who falls feeds the final awakening. You are not abominations. You are the harbingers of the Rana Dandra. Ilara Voss laughed a sound like breaking crystal. Then let the galaxy burn twice over if death itself marches at our side. Who can stand against the Pale? Draven was silent for a long while. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of 10,000 years of betrayal. And death has marched with us since Cerberus Prime. We are tired of being its heralds. But the choice was no longer his to make far away on Macraga Roboute. Guilliman rose from the apothecarian slab where Belisarius Caul had spent 9 months excising the pale plague from his blood. The avenging sun's skin still bore the marble-white scars of infection. His eyes, once the clear blue of Ultramar's skies, now held a faint gray cast. Like winter dawn, he convened the Senatorum Imperialis in secret session and delivered a decree that had not been spoken since the heresy. The 11th Legion is declared. Excommunicate traitoris extremis no quarter. No record, no mercy, their gene seed is to be burned wherever it is found. Their name is to be erased a second time, and more thoroughly than the first. 10 chapters of Guilliman's own unnumbered sons, the entire Knights Excelsior. Chapter 5, Custodes Shield Hosts, led by Shield Captain Valerian No Relation, and 3 full cadres of Sisters of Silence were dispatched into the Ghoul Stars, under the banner of the Pale Purge. They arrived above Vorgoth Prime to find a wall of white warships and a single Vox transmission from Ilara Voss herself. Broadcast on every Imperial frequency, "Welcome, Lord Guilliman, you are too late. The 11th has risen, stand aside, or be judged as your father once judged us." The war that followed was the bloodiest campaign since the Indomitus Crusade's darkest days. Entire sectors burned. Pale Suns walked through exterminatus fire and kept marching Primaris Marines. Discovered that their enhanced physiology only accelerated the plague's spread, Custodes Auramite cracked beneath Draven's shard scythe. Sisters of Silence found their null fields useless against warriors whose very souls had been touched by Ennead's cold hand in the void above Cry the Prime. Guilliman's flagship, Macraga's Honor, fought a running battle against the Pallid Oath. Boarding torpedoes slammed into both hulls. Ultramarines in Gravis armor clashed with Pale Suns in ancient Mark II plate. The corridors ran red and white, and in the deepest crypt of Crythe Prime beneath a fortress, built from the bones of a Satan Kale Draven, prepared for the final stand. The Battle of Crythe Prime lasted 9 Terran years, and ended the dream of every empire that had ever dared to rise in the Ghoul Stars. Cry the Prime had not been a planet for centuries. It was a hollowed sphere of blackstone and necrodermis, its core replaced by the bound shard of the Deceiver. Now pulsing like a diseased heart around it, orbited the entire Pale Fleet, 1,000 white-hulled vessels crewed by 20,000 original Pale Suns, and 1,000,000 hybrid descendants born in the gene forges of Vorgoth. Ilara Voss ruled from the Pallid Oath, now grown to the size of a Gloriana through Necron phase technology. Kale Draven walked its halls as Pale Lord Reaper, his armor no longer merely white, but veined with living blackstone that shifted like oil on water Roboute. Guilliman came with everything the Imperium Sanctus could spare. 10 chapters of Primaris heavy unnumbered sons, the entire Knights Excelsior chapter in their sky-blue ceramite. 5 full Custodes shield hosts under Shield Captain Valerian of the Aquilan Shield, 3,000 Sisters of Silence in their vow-bound null armor, the phalanx itself towed through the rift by 100 Navy tugs, its Nova cannon primed for planet-killing fury. They arrived above Crythe Prime, in a wall of gold and blue and silver, and the void lit with the fire of a second heresy. The first 6 months were fought in open space. Pale ships phased through macro-cannon broadsides and rematerialized inside enemy formations. Custodes boarding parties discovered that their guardian spears could kill a Pale Sun, but only for minutes. Sisters of Silence null fields slowed the regeneration, but never stopped it. The phalanx's lance batteries carved the Pallid Oath in half, only for the 2 sections to rejoin hours later. Blackstone flowing like liquid to seal the wound, Guilliman watched the hololith in the stratagium of the Macraga's Honor and felt something he had not felt since the resurrection despair. Then the ground war began. Cry the Prime's surface was a labyrinth of tomb corridors and gene vaults stretching 1,000 kilometers deep. The Pale Suns had prepared for this moment. For 9 years, every corridor was a kill zone. Every vault, a fortress hybrid, pale ultramarines in cobalt and white plate, fought beside original 11th in ancient mark, their bolters singing the same song of vengeance that had echoed across Cerberus Prime 10,000 years earlier. The fighting reached depths where the laws of physics frayed in the Deceiver's central crypt. Reality itself became negotiable. Custodies found themselves fighting their own reflections. Sisters of Silence screamed as their null auras inverted and began to amplify psychic phenomena instead of dampening them. Primaris Inceptors fell from the sky only to land centuries in the past, fighting Pale Suns, who had not yet been born in the 9th year. Guilliman led the final push in person. He descended to the planet's core with a bodyguard of 300 Victrix Guard and every remaining custodes. The corridors narrowed until only single-file combat was possible. Pale Suns waited in perfect silence, bolters' leveled eyes glowing with cold starlight. They fought for 30 hours without pause. Guilliman's armor of fate was cracked in a dozen places. The Emperor's sword dripped pale ichor that refused to burn away. The hand of Dominion flickered with failing energy beside him. Shield Captain Valerian fought with a guardian spear that had tasted the blood of gods, yet every Pale Sun he felled rose again within minutes at the heart of the Deceiver's crypt. They found Kael Draven waiting alone. He stood upon a dais of blackstone, the bound Cetan shard pulsing behind him like a second sun. His armor was scarred beyond recognition, yet still pristine. White beneath the damage in his hands, he held the power scythe that had wounded Guilliman twice, before the two warriors regarded each other across a chamber that spanned realities. "You should not have come, brother," Draven said quietly. The word brother fell between them like a blade. "I have no brother here," Guilliman replied, but his voice lacked conviction. They fought. It was not the elegant dueling of holodramas. It was the brutal, exhausting clash of demigods who had nothing left to prove and everything to lose. The Emperor's sword carved a furrow from Draven's left pauldron to right hip. The scythe took Guilliman's left arm at the elbow. Regeneration began instantly on both sides. Pale flesh knitting blue ceramite flowing like water around them. The Deceiver's chains began to crack. Yvraine stepped from a webway portal that had not existed moments before the sword of silent screams sang in her hand. "The cycle completes," she whispered. "One must fall so that death may rise." Draven looked at her, then at Guilliman bleeding but unbowed, then at the ranks of his undying brothers filling the chamber beyond their eyes, no longer angry, only tired. And for the first time since Cerberus Prime, Kael Draven of the 11th Legion made a choice that was not vengeance. He knelt not to Guilliman, not to Yvraine, but to the memory of a father who had once loved him enough to order his death, rather than let him become the end of all things with his own hands. Draven activated the failsafe Malcador had built into every cryovault 10,000 years earlier. Necrodermis charges planted as insurance against the very resurrection now occurring, ignited in perfect sequence. The Deceiver's shard screamed as its prison collapsed. Reality inverted. The planet began to fold in on itself like burning paper. "No!" Guilliman roared, reaching for Draven with his remaining hand. Draven met his brother's eyes one final time. "Tell Russ we held the line." Then the fire took them all when the light faded. Cry the Prime was gone. In its place hung a new asteroid belt of blackstone and frozen flesh. The Pale Fleet was annihilated. The Imperial Armada limped away, missing half its strength. Guilliman stood upon the bridge of the battered Macraga's honor with an empty sleeve where his arm had been staring at the debris field that had once been a Legion Yvraine, vanished into the webway with a sorrowful smile and a whisper that only Guilliman heard, "The pale suns are not ended, they are complete." Years later, in the darkest corners of Imperium, Nihilist guardsmen began to report sightings of white-armored figures who appeared during the most hopeless battles. They never spoke. They never took prisoners, they simply held the line until the enemy broke, then vanished like ghosts on 1,000 worlds. Astropaths heard the same Vox transmission on a frequency dead since the heresy. We held the line, we hold it still for the Emperor, for the Pale. And in the deepest vault of the phalanx sealed behind wards that even the custodes may not open. Roboute Guilliman keeps a single shard of white ceramite etched with a vertical scar through the aquila. Sometimes, when the Astronomicon flickers and the great rift howls, the avenging sun takes it out and holds it to the light. And for a moment, just a moment, the marble scars on his skin fade to living flesh. And he remembers the brother he never knew he had in the grim darkness of the far future. There is only war, but sometimes in the silence between bolter shots, there is also duty, and sometimes, just sometimes, there is forgiveness. Yet the story did not truly end at Cry the Prime, for death itself had become the Pale Sun's final ally, and death is never finished. With the Emperor's children in the decades that followed, the asteroid belt of Krythe became known as the Pale Shroud, and Voidfarers swore that on certain nights when the Astronomicon guttered low, the shattered hulks of the Pallid Oath and the Macraga's honor drifted together as if still locked in their final embrace, and pale figures walked the vacuum between them untouched by the cold of the void on Baal. Dante woke from the sleep of centuries to find a single white gauntlet resting upon the sarcophagus of Sanguinius. The gauntlet bore the vertical scar of expurgation, and inside it lay a single drop of blood that burned with the light of a dying star. When the chapter master touched it, the black rage quieted in every blood angel. For the first time since the heresy on Fenris, the wolf priests discovered an ancient thunderwolf that would not age, its fur white as winter, its eyes the pale gray of Droven's own, and when it howled, the rune priests heard the words, "We held the line," carried on the wind on Prospero's ruins. Ahriman's rubric marines stood motionless for 100 days, staring toward the ghoul stars, as if waiting for a command that would never come. And in the deepest vaults of the rock, the Watcher in the dark, who had once carried the lion sword, now carried a shard of white ceramite, etched with the same scarred Aquila Guilliman, kept his own shard locked behind wards of null maidens and custodes. Yet every year, on the anniversary of Crythe Prime, the vault door opened of its own accord, and the shard was gone for exactly one solar day, returning at dawn, with frost upon its surface and the faint scent of cryogas in the sealed chamber. The avenging sun never spoke of it, but the marble scars upon his skin grew fainter with each passing cycle, and in the blackest reaches of Nihilus, where the light of Terra had never reached the pale suns, walked again not as conquerors, not as avengers, but as the Emperor's final mercy, white-armored ghosts appearing on 1,000 forgotten battlefields where guardsmen faced annihilation against demon tides or Necron awakenings or tyrannid swarms without number. They never spoke their names. They never declared allegiance. They simply formed the line and held it until the enemy broke, then vanished like mist before the dawn. Astropaths heard the same Vox transmission on a frequency dead since the heresy. We held the line, we hold it still for the Emperor, for the Pale, and in the deepest vault of the phalanx, sealed behind wards that even the custodes may not open, Roboute Guilliman keeps a single shard of white ceramite etched with a vertical scar through the aquila. Sometimes when the Astronomicon flickers and the great rift howls, the avenging sun takes it out and holds it to the light. And for a moment, just a moment, the marble scars on his skin fade to living flesh. And he remembers the brother he never knew he had in the grim darkness of the far future. There is only war, but sometimes in the silence between bolter shots, there is also duty, and sometimes, just sometimes, there is forgiveness. The Pale Suns are not ended. They are complete and they hold the line forever, and so the Pale Resurrection did not conclude with fire and ruin upon Cry the Prime, but instead became something quieter, something eternal, something that even the High Lords of Terra could never fully expunge from the soul of the Imperium. For in the centuries that followed, the Pale Suns walked the darkest corners of Nihilus, not as conquerors, nor as heretics, but as the Emperor's last unspoken apology, white-armored phantoms who appeared without warning on battlefields where hope had already died. And the only sound was the screaming of the lost. They materialized from swirling cryo-mist or stepped out of bulkheads that had been solid seconds before bolters raised in perfect synchronization, and they held the line against horrors that no mortal regiment could face. Sometimes a single pale sun would stand alone against a demon prince, until the creature's essence withered and blew away like ash on the wind. Sometimes an entire phalanx of 20,000 would descend upon a tyrannid hive fleet, turning the swarm's own biomass against it, until the leviathans rotted from within and collapsed into gibbering sludge. Sometimes they fought beside ultramarines, who did not know whether to raise their weapons in salute or in terror, and when the battle was over, the Pale Suns simply vanished, leaving behind only frost on the ground and the echo of an ancient Vox transmission. We held the line, we hold it still for the Emperor, for the Pale. No one ever claimed their bodies. No one ever found their gene seed. No one ever heard them speak a name, yet every world they saved whispered the same legend of white angels who came when all light had failed, and who asked nothing in return. Not glory, not worship, not even acknowledgement. Only the chance to keep the promise their father had forced them to break 10,000 years earlier. And in the deepest vault of the phalanx, behind wards of null maidens and custodes who never slept, Roboute Guilliman kept his shard of scarred white ceramite every year on the anniversary of Cry the Prime. The vault opened of its own accord, and the shard vanished for exactly one solar day, returning at dawn, rimed with frost, and carrying the faint scent of cryogas. And the avenging sun never spoke of it, but those who served closest to him noticed that the marble pallor of his skin grew fainter with every cycle, until one could almost believe the plague had never touched him at all. And on the night the Astronomicon finally flickered and died, for the first time in 10,000 years, Guilliman stood alone upon the phalanx's observation deck, staring into the great rift. And for one heartbeat, the void was filled with white light, 20,000 pale stars burning where no stars had any right to be. And he closed his eyes and whispered a single word he had never been allowed to speak before: brother. And somewhere in the darkness beyond the light of Terra, Kyle Draven heard him and answered with the only reply that had ever mattered. We held the line. The Pale Suns are not gone. They are not forgiven. They are not redeemed. They simply are the Emperor's final unbreakable shield. The last fragment of his dream that refused to die, even when he ordered it to, and in the grim darkness of the far future. Where there is only war, there is also sometimes in the silence between the bolter's roar and the dying scream of the last guardsman, a single white figure standing motionless against the tide, holding the line until the enemy breaks or the stars themselves go out. And when the battle ends and the smoke clears and the survivors fall to their knees in awe or terror, the figure is already gone, leaving only frost and the echo of an oath older than the Imperium itself. We held the line, we hold it still for the Emperor, for the Pale, and the galaxy endures a little longer because of it. This is the true chronicle of the 11th Legion, not of conquest, not of vengeance, but of duty carried beyond death, beyond betrayal, beyond even the Emperor's own command. They were the sons he feared the most, because they were the only ones who understood what his dream would truly cost. And in the end, they paid that cost willingly. Not for forgiveness, not for remembrance, but because someone had to hold the line, and no one else ever would. The pale resurrection never ended. It simply became eternal, and the Emperor upon his golden throne, whether in agony or in silence, knows that somewhere in the warp-torn void, 20,000 white-armored ghosts still march, still fight, still refuse to fall, and for the first time in 10,000 years, the Emperor protects